Welcome to the lecture on administrative rules and regulations. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at yet another of the primary sources of law in the United States. As a reminder, the other primary sources of law are constitutions, statutes, executive orders, and case law. But before we can understand what administrative rules and regulations are, we need to understand something about the bodies that make these laws. And these are called administrative agencies. You'll see here there's a bowl of soup on the slide, and we have the initials for the first names of the names of two federal agencies, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and then the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Typically, administrative agency names are an alphabet soup in this way. But let's understand why we have them to begin with. Well, as a practical matter, the United States Congress, state legislatures, and local governments, when they enact statutes, cannot, as a practical matter, oversee the actual day-to-day implementation and administration of those statutes. So for this reason, Congress, state legislatures, and local government, as part of their statutes, will create other official bodies to implement and administer those statutes. And normally, these other official bodies are part of the executive branch of the government. Now, the terms for these legislatively created bodies include administrative agencies, as we've just seen, government agencies, public agencies, regulatory agencies, and of course, agencies that are in the federal government are often referred to as federal agencies, and then state agencies are the agencies that are part of one of the 50 state governments. So here's some examples of federal agencies. We have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which administers and enforces federal civil rights laws against workplace discrimination. Then, as we saw in the bowl of soup, we have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And that agency enforces federal laws relating to the safety of food and drugs. We also have the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, which administers and enforces federal antitrust, that is anti-monopoly, and consumer protection laws. And as a fourth example, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which regulates the purchase and sale of securities, that is, of corporate stocks and bonds. Now, of course, there are a lot of other federal agencies. This chart is simply an example of four of them. Now, here's some examples of Texas agencies. We have the Railroad Commission of Texas, the RRC, which, despite its name, actually regulates the oil, gas, coal, and pipeline industries in Texas. It used to regulate the railroad industry in Texas, but no longer does so, but it has retained the name. We also have the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission, the TABC, which regulates, inspects, and taxes the production, sale, and use of alcoholic beverages in the state. We have the Texas Department of Insurance, or TDI, which regulates the insurance industry in Texas. And we have the Texas Workforce Commission, or TWC, which provides unemployment benefits and services related to employment to eligible individuals and businesses. Now, again, Texas has lots of other agencies. These are just four of them. Well, let's talk now about how the legislatures or Congress or local governments create these agencies to help administer and enforce the laws. And the creation of these agencies occurs through what is called enabling legislation. That is a statute that authorizes the creation of an administrative agency and specifies the name, purpose, and powers that that agency may exercise. So here's an example of an enabling legislation statute, and this relates to a fairly old law. It's called the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. And that act authorized the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. And this law is codified in Title 15 of the United States Code at Section 41. So here on the slide is an excerpt from Section 41. Now, you'll notice that the statute says Federal Trade Commission established. That's the heading. And then it goes on to say that a commission is created and established to be known as the Federal Trade Commission, which shall be composed of 5 commissioners who shall be appointed by the president by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. So here, Congress, in this Section 41, authorized the creation and establishment of the FTC. Now, normally, these statutes not only will create the agency, but also will specify, that is, authorize and empower the agency to engage in specified activities. So let's look at the activity that the enabling statute for the FTC empowered the FTC to engage in. And this is in a different section. This is in Title 15 of the United States Code, Section 45A2. So here it is. And in the heading to Section 45, it says unfair methods of competition unlawful, semicolon, prevention by commission. So the heading gives us a clue as to one of the tasks the commission is now empowered to do, that is to prevent unfair methods of competition. And then subsection A has its own heading, declaration of unlawfulness, and then semicolon, power to prohibit unfair practices. So again, even in the headings to Section 45 and subsection A, we are given a clue that this subsection is going to contain empowerment of the FTC. And so here finally is subsection 2, and it says the commission is hereby empowered and directed to prevent persons, partnerships, or corporations, with stated exceptions, from using unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. So there we have sort of a broad statement of the powers of the FTC. Now, typically, an agency is authorized in more detail to perform 3 basic categories of functions. Now, these 3 categories of functions mirror on the administrative level, that is, at the government agency level, the functions of the respective 3 branches of government generally. And collectively, these functions are called the administrative process. So here are the 3 basic functions of the administrative process. The first one is one that is very important, and it's called rulemaking. That is, the agency is empowered and authorized to make rules and regulations to carry out, to administer, and to enforce the statute that was enacted by the legislature. And so rulemaking by the agency has a quasi-legislative function. Now, again, the agency is not itself a legislature, but it has been empowered by the legislature to make rules and regulations that assist the agency in carrying out the functions that have been delegated to it by the legislature. So rulemaking is one of the 3 functions. The second function is investigation and enforcement when there is deemed a possible violator of the statute. So normally, an administrative agency is empowered to investigate possible violations of the statute and to enforce the statute. Well, this investigation and enforcement function is the executive function of the executive branch of government. So it is a quasi-executive function. And finally, government agencies are often empowered to adjudicate disputes that the agency has with the persons who are being charged with violating the statute. And this is a quasi-judicial function, which in the three main branches of government would be exercised by the judicial branch. And so in exercising the adjudication function, the agency will typically conduct out of court but trial-like hearings to resolve disputes involving agency rules and regulations. So now let's look at these three functions in more detail. The first one being rulemaking. Now, let me give you sort of a working definition. A rulemaking function consists of actions undertaken by administrative agencies when formally adopting new rules or regulations or amending new ones. Now, in the rulemaking process and other functions, administrative agencies must normally strictly follow procedures that are prescribed by law. And a lot of agencies are subject to the applicable Administrative Procedure Acts for the jurisdiction. So, for example, in the federal system, there's a statute called the Federal Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, codified at Title V, United States Code, in Chapter 5, Subchapter I, Sections 500 and following. Now, in Texas, we have the Texas Administrative Procedures Act, which is codified in the Texas Government Code in Title 10, Chapter 2001. Now, these two statutes differ in their details, and there are going to be some agencies that are not going to be subject to these statutes necessarily, but may be subject to other administrative requirements. But here, when you compare what must be done under the Federal Administrative Procedure Act and the Texas Administrative Procedure Act, you're going to find some basic common requirements. First, the agency, when proposing a new rule or regulation or proposing to amend a new rule or a regulation, must first publish a notice in the applicable government newspaper. So to put the public on notice that the agency is considering making this rule or amending this rule. In the federal government, that publication is called the Federal Register. It's the daily newspaper for federal administrative agencies and the federal executive branch generally. Now, in Texas, the analogous publication is called the Texas Register. So the agency must first publish a notice in the appropriate register, federal or Texas, stating when and where the agency's rulemaking proceedings will occur, and the terms or subject matter of the proposed new rule or the proposed amendment to an existing rule. Secondly, after publishing this notice, the agency must allow time for any interested parties to comment in writing on the proposals. The agency must then review the comments received, and then the agency must consider the comments when drafting the final version of the regulation. After that, the agency must write the final version of the rule, and then finally, the agency must publish the final version of the rule in the Federal Register or the Texas Register, whichever is applicable. So there has to be a notice published in the Federal or Texas Register of the proposed rule, and then once the final rule has been adopted, then that final version has to be published also in the Federal Register or Texas Register. And of course, if you are dealing with an administrative agency in another state, then there may be different requirements, or a publication with a different type of name. But I'm using Texas as our exemplar of state administrative procedures. Okay, so that's the first function, the rule-making function. Now let's look at the second function, investigation and enforcement. Now, when investigating a potential violation of a statute, the administrative agency is commonly authorized to do the following: to request that individuals or organizations hand over specific papers, files, or other documents, and depending on the agency and the nature of the statutes involved, the agency may have the right to conduct on-site inspections to determine whether there has been a violation of the statute. Now, after investigating, if the administrative agency determines that an individual or business has violated the statute, then the agency commonly may take administrative action against the individual or business involved. Now, most administrative actions are resolved through negotiated settlements with the accused party. But if settlement is not possible, then the agency may issue a formal complaint against the suspected violator, and the case may then proceed to administrative adjudication, that is, to function 3. Now here, when I say that the agency issues a formal complaint, I don't mean that it's filing a lawsuit. All of these, the administrative process, by definition, is occurring at the agency level, at the administrative level, not in a court system. But if you do have a situation where there has been an accusation that someone has violated a statute, and but there is not a possibility of settling that dispute, then the third function, adjudication, comes into play. So what will happen is that the agency will schedule an administrative hearing. Now, this hearing is an out of court, but often resembling a trial process before an administrative law judge, or ALJ for short. Now, during this hearing, representatives of both the agency and the charged party will present their conflicting evidence and their conflicting arguments to the administrative law judge. Now, the administrative law judge is not a judge in a court of law. Again, this whole process is not occurring in court. Rather, the administrative law judge is an employee of the agency, but by law is required to be unbiased when presiding over an administrative hearing. And so an ALJ typically has the power at these hearings to administer oaths to witnesses who will be testifying, to take testimony from those witnesses, to rule on any questions of evidence, and to make determinations of fact, that is, to resolve factual disputes that the parties have based on the evidence presented at the hearing. Now, again, these powers of an administrative law judge resemble a great deal the powers that a judge in a court of law has, but again, this is not in a court of law. Now, so the ALJ will make a decision on the dispute. Now, depending on what that decision is, the charged party, if that party loses, may have to then pay a fine or be prohibited from engaging in certain activities that would violate the statute. Now, if either side that is unhappy with the ALJ's decision may normally appeal that decision through an internal agency review or appeal process. Now, once the agency has completed its procedures, that is, it's been appealed as far as it can be through the agency process, then the dissatisfied party may then seek review of the agency's decision in a court of law. But note that there's a doctrine called exhaustion of administrative remedies. And under this doctrine, a person who is unhappy with the decision of the agency normally is not allowed to sue in a court of law and seek review of that decision until that person has exhausted or taken advantage of all the available remedies for dispute resolution at the agency level. So this is called, that is, the person must first exhaust his or her administrative remedies before that person is entitled to file suit and seek judicial review in a court of law. Now, of course, if no party appeals the ALJ's decision, or if the agency declines to review the case further, or if indeed a court, for whatever reason, declines to review the ALJ's decision, then the ALJ's decision becomes final. So those are the three basic functions of the administrative agency in what is called the administrative process. Now let's shift our focus. We know what an administrative agency is and what it does. Now let's talk about administrative law. And you'll see here a picture of the printouts of all the federal regulations as of 2017. Regulations have been criticized by many as being too numerous, too pervasive, and too detailed. And of course, others believe they're absolutely necessary to enforce and administer our laws and to keep and for the safety and well-being of people in the country. But in any event, they are numerous, and this is just the federal regulations as of 2017. So administrative law is the whole body of law created by administrative agencies. And these laws can take the form of rules or regulations. And for our purposes, I'm going to use rules and regulations interchangeably. There are also orders by administrative law judges, for example, and decisions that agencies make to carry out their duties and responsibilities. So the whole body of these rules and orders and decisions constitute administrative law. Now, we are going to start examining the sources of federal administrative law first, and then state administrative law using Texas law as our example. So let's start off now with federal administrative law. What are its sources? How do you find it? Well, the first publication, as we've just seen, of a new rule or regulation or a newly amended existing rule or regulation is the Federal Register. And again, that's the daily newspaper for the federal administrative agencies and the federal executive branch of government. It's published on Mondays through Fridays, except for legal holidays. Now, the Federal Register will contain all proposed and newly final administrative regulations. It'll also contain agency notices, executive orders and proclamations by the US President, and so forth. Now, I'm going to show you the different editions or versions of the Federal Register that you have available. The government does publish a print version of the Federal Register. The Government Publishing Office publishes this this edition or this issue, and it looks something like this on the screen. So there are print editions, and you may have access to a law library or other library, maybe a federal depository library, where you do have these print versions available to you. But If you don't have the print versions available to you, there's good news. There's an online edition of the Federal Register at the Government Publishing Office website, which is federalregister.gov. So if you go to that website, here is a screen capture. This screen capture is dated November 25th. And you'll see here that one of your options is to browse or read the current issue. And the current issue will, of course, depend on the date on which you access this website. So below that, though, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, you have another option. You can word search Federal Register issues going back to 1994. So you may have be wanting to search for new regulations or newly adopted regulations that are not in the current issue. So you would then have the option to word search an archive going back to 94. But let's now bump back up to the screen and look at the current issue. So if you wanted to read the current issue, you would just click on the link for current issue. And when you do that, you are now taken to the Federal Register page for that issue. And this one happens to be dated November 25th, 2020. And so you'll see here that at the or toward the top of the page, you have a breakdown of the contents of this particular issue. There are 108 agency notices. There are 2 presidential documents. There are 6 proposed rules. And then there are 12 newly adopted, that is final rules. So if you're looking, for example, for proposed rules, then you can click on the link for 6 proposed rules to filter the contents to those rules alone. So let's do that. Let's click on the 6 proposed rules link. And that takes us now to a page that deals only with the 6 proposed rules by federal agencies. Now, one thing you can do right off the bat is if you don't want to read through all the rules, instead you want to word search just the proposed rules, then here there is a find box where you can type in your search terms, and it will search only the 6 proposed rules. Or an alternative method is simply to scroll down the page to browse the proposed rules. And so let's do that. Let's browse the proposed rules by just scrolling down, and you'll see here that we have the Food and Nutrition Service has a proposed rule. The Comptroller of the Currency has a proposed rule as well. And you'll notice that next to each of these proposed rules is a circle with PR in it, standing for proposed rule. Well, let's say that you're interested in this proposed rule by the Comptroller of the Currency. And the topic of the proposed rule is fair access to financial services. So it gives you a little summary of this proposed rule right here in the index. It says the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is proposing a regulation to ensure that national banks and federal savings associations offer and provide fair access to financial services. So let's click on this proposed rule to see what it says about it. So here we are, new screen, fair access to financial services. And this was a proposed rule, a rule proposed by the Comptroller of the Currency on November 25th, 2020. Now notice about third of the way down of the screen that there is a text box where you can submit a formal comment on the proposed rule. Now, this is the way that interested parties, people who may be affected by this rule one way or the other, whether you're in the financial industry or consumer protection industry or whatever, can type in your comments. Now, a little bit lower down the screen, there'll be some instructions on the structure of the comment and certain identifying information about the proposed rule that you have to state. But this is where you would type it in and then you would click on submit a formal comment when you're ready to send it. Then below that comment submission feature, you have the preamble to the proposed rule. And this simply gives you some basic information. First off, like what agency proposes the rule, what is the action taken here in the Federal Register, which is notice of proposed rulemaking, a summary, which we've just read in the index, and then it goes on to provide supplementary information, background information, which can get very detailed, but it can be very helpful when you are trying to assess um, a particular proposed rule. And so here the agency has provided some background information to laws that are in the background of this proposed rule and other details about the events leading up to the perceived need for the rule. Now, part two of the preamble is a detailed description of the proposal, that is, of the proposed rule. This is not the actual text of the proposed rule itself. It is simply indicating the purposes of the proposed rule and what the agency believes the proposed rule would accomplish. Now, finally, and you'll see here on the screen, we get to the actual text of the proposed rule. And so here it says it would be uh, section 55.1, fair access to financial services, and then it goes on and it reads very much like a statute with subsections and so forth. And so this is the actual text of the proposed rule. So that's how you see a proposed rule in the Federal Register on the government's website. But if you have Westlaw or Lexis, the paid legal research subscription, then you can also access the Federal Register. So here I'm going to use Westlaw as our example. So here's how you find the Federal Register on Westlaw. You go to the home page of Westlaw, and then in the Browse pane on the home page, you're going to want to click on Federal Materials because we're looking for the Federal Register. Now, you could stay in the All Content tab instead and click on Regulations and then click on Federal Regulations, but I've decided just to go ahead and go to the Federal Materials tab, and then under that tab, you'll see Federal Register -all. And so you'll want to click on Federal Register, and here it is. Now, you'll see that it has the 10 most recent documents from the Federal Register listed. So whenever you click on Federal Register on Westlaw, you'll always see the 10 most recent documents from the publication listed. But here are some options once you get to this screen. First off, at the top of the screen next to the Thomson Reuters Westlaw icon, you have the search box. And if you want to word search the entire Federal Register, then you can do it. You can simply type in your search terms and click on the orange magnifying glass button, and then it will pull up any Federal Register documents that contain your search terms. Another thing you can do is if you know that you are looking only for proposed or newly adopted regulations, as opposed to some of the other materials that the Federal Register contains, then here in the right-hand column menu, you can click on Federal Proposed and Adopted Regulations, Current. And so if you click on that, then it limits the Federal Register materials that you're dealing with to those that set forth proposed and adopted regulations. So once you get to that screen, then you also have the option to go back up to the top in the text box and search only in the proposed and adopted rules if you have a particular word or phrase that you're looking for. Another option is that you can simply scroll down and browse the most recent proposed and adopted rules. So let's do that. Let's just scroll down, and the very last of the list, number 10, happens to be the same proposed rule that we saw on the government's website a second ago. It is the Fair Access to Financial Services rule proposed by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And so then if you wanted to read the same information that we saw on the government's website, you would just click here on 85 FR, which stands for Federal Register, 7526-01. That's its Federal Register citation. And so you click on that, and then you will see pretty much what you saw on the federal government's website, only now it's digitized for purposes of Westlaw. So that is where you find the proposed rules or newly adopted rules by federal government agencies. Now I want to show you the second of the two federal sources for rules, and that is the permanent resting place for final rules and regulations, and that's called the Code of Federal Regulations. So after a rule has been adopted and announced in the Federal Register, then it will ultimately make its way into the Permanent Code of Federal Regulations, CFR for short. And the CFR is divided into numbered titles, which correspond to the numbered titles of the United States Code, which is very nice and convenient. Now, the format, as I've mentioned, of administrative rules and regulations is very similar to the format of statutes. That is, they consist of complete sentences, but oftentimes the sentences may be fairly long with parallel clauses or phrases or lists that are often indented with numbers or letters so that it's easier to read on the page, and also it's easier to cite to a specific subsection or subsection in your legal writing. And so, but the regulations overall will look like statutes in their format. Now, each title of the CFR is normally revised at least once a year. So here is the print edition of the CFR, and it's published by the Government Publishing Office of the federal government. And as you can see here, here are a couple of individual issues of the CFR. And then here is the paperback set that you can see here on the right. And these are paperback publications. Because each title is revised at least once a year, they're not going to publish these in leatherback volumes for permanency through the ages, but they are paperback, and this is what they look like. Now, you can also get the Code of Federal Regulations for free at the Government Publishing Office's website. It's the same general website where we saw the Federal Register, only here the website address is ecfr.gov. It's called ECFR because the online edition is called the E for electronic CFR. And so here is what you will see if you go there. On the left-hand navigation menu, you have aids. You can search, you can browse, that is, you can simply read through the CFR for what you want. You can do simple word searches to find what you want. You can do more advanced searches with Boolean terms. And there is a link here for search tips and so forth. Now you'll notice here at the very bottom of the screen, here is how you can browse the titles of the CFR. It's a drop-down menu, and so the first one in the menu is Title 1, General Provisions, but you could click on the down arrow to pull down the rest of the menu and select another title, and then you could just read it. And so again, this is for free. Now, if you have Westlaw or Lexis, you can also get the CFR on either one of those services. So let's use Westlaw as an example. Again, starting at the Westlaw homepage, in the Browse pane, go to Federal Materials again, as we did with the Federal Register. Only this time, instead of clicking on Federal Register, you want to click on Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. Now, when you do that, you'll come to a screen that lists every title of the CFR. Now, I want to mention one thing. You'll see here about a third of the way down the screen, there is a way to select the effective date of the regulations you want to see. And so normally the effective date will be the date that you are researching, or at least the last business date that wasn't a holiday before the date you're researching. But if you want to see a federal regulation that was in effect on an earlier date, you can change that date. So just keep that in mind. Now you can also go to if you want a word search in the entire CFR, then you can go to the top of the screen and in the text box, type your search terms, and then Westlaw will pull up all CFR sections that contain your search terms. Now there's another way to look for relevant regulations to your research, and that is through a word index. Here in the right-hand navigation menu under Tools and Resources, you'll see a link called Code of Federal Regulations Index. It's like a descriptive word index like you would find at the end of the United States Code. And so if you weren't sure about what search terms you should type in the box at the top, you could instead click on this link for the index, and you would see this next screen, which is simply alphabetical by descriptive word or phrase. And so it starts with the letter A and has all these words and phrases beginning with the letter A. You would scroll down, and then at the top you can change letters to B, C, D, and so forth. And then if you see a word or phrase that appears to be relevant to your research, you can click on it, and then Westlaw will identify the title number and section numbers of the CFR that relate to that word or phrase. So that's the word index method for searching the CFR. So let's go back now to the home page for the CFR on Westlaw and want to look at a third option of researching the CFR, and that is simply to browse, or that is read through the titles. And you can see here that there's a link for each title individually, and so you would just browse that list of titles until you find one that appears to deal with the topic you're interested in. So let's say that you're interested in Title 8, Aliens and Nationality. So if you want to open that title, then you would just click on it or click on the box to the left of it, and that will expand the title into its component parts. So here on this screen, we have the outline for Title 8, Aliens and Nationality. Now, again, if you want to word search all of Title 8, then you can go to the top of the screen and in the text box, type in your search terms, and Westlaw will pull up all documents within Title 8 that contain your search terms. Or you can continue to browse the contents of Title 8. And so let's say that you've browsed the contents and you think Chapter 1 of Title 8, Department of Homeland Security, is the chapter that is most relevant to your research. So then you browse the subchapters under Chapter 1. There's subchapter A, B, and C. And let's say you're interested in subchapter A, General Provisions. So to see subchapter A, just click on the plus sign to the left of it, and it will expand subchapter A and reveal its component parts, parts 1, 2, and 3. And so if you decide that part 2 is most relevant to your research, then you can click on the plus sign to the left of part 2 and expand it. And it finally will then get to the smallest subdivision level, that is the section numbers. Now here, part 2 actually only has one section in it. Other parts might have multiple sections. But this section number is 2.1. And so you can click on 2.1 to read the text of the section. That is the actual regulation. And so here is the screen for Title 8 CFR Section 2.1, the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, let's look at the geography of this page. You can see here the text of the rule. You have the citation to it, 8 CFR Section 2.1. Below that, you have the subject heading for that section. And then underneath at the bottom, you have the actual beginning of that section's text. All authorities and functions in the Department of Homeland Security to administer and enforce the immigration laws are vested in the Secretary of Homeland Security, and so forth. So that's the actual text of the rule, and it continues on below. You would have to keep scrolling down. But notice here above the text of the rule, we have a little outline. It's called a breadcrumb trail that helps you keep your bearings as to where you are in the entire Code of Federal Regulations. It shows that you're in the Code of Federal Regulations, you're in Title 8, you're in Chapter 1, Subchapter A, Part 2. And so this helps you not get lost in the forest, but it also enables you to backtrack. Because if you decided that maybe part 2 was not the right part, instead you should have gone to part 5 or whatever, then you could go to the breadcrumb trail and click on subchapter A so that you could review the list of the numbered parts again and go a different direction. So that's your breadcrumb trail. Now notice at above the breadcrumb trail, you have tabs, which are key cite tabs. Now we looked at these when researching cases and statutes, but again, these are how you validate a regulation. Administrative rules and regulations have to be validated just as other types of laws to make sure that they're still good law, or to see whether any courts or and particularly with administrative agencies, any administrative decisions have interpreted the language or applied the language of the regulation in some way that would be relevant to your research. So we're going to look more detail at these key cite tabs when we get to Texas regulations a bit later in the lecture. but I wanted to point them out here so that you're aware that they are here. So if you wanted to continue reading the text of section 2.1, you'd simply scroll down, and then you can see it has the rest of the text here. Now, after the text of the section itself, there's a section called credits. And in this section, you will have citations to the Federal Register that led up to this particular section of the CFR. And then there's another entry that says authority. And this is the statutory authority that underlies the creation or making of this particular administrative rule. Finally, at the bottom is a notation of the currentness of the rule. And so normally when you do pull up, unless you decide to search the archives on Westlaw of the CFR, the section that will pull up will be the most current section. And so here we're told that this section is current through November 26, 2020. This will normally be the date of your research, or at least the business date that is not a holiday immediately preceding the date of your research. Okay, so finally, how do you cite federal administrative rules and regulations using proper Blue Book citation form? So if you are in your legal writing wanting to state a regulation or summarize a regulation, and then you have to, of course, identify where that regulation can be found. So I'm going to show you how to cite the Code of Federal Regulations using proper Blue Book citation form. You will notice that the citation format to an administrative regulation is very similar to the citation format of a statute. And so here's an example. Let's say that you are wanting to cite Title 7 of the Code of Federal Regulations, section 319.76, and the edition of the Code of Federal Regulations you are using is the 1999 edition. Now, normally you want to use the most recent edition in your research. And so this very well could be 2019 or 2020. But generally, unless you're citing an older regulation that is no longer in force, then you would want to cite the most recent edition of the Code of Federal Regulations, or of the volume that the regulation appears in. But here is the Blue Book citation form for this particular regulation. You start off with the title number, which is 7, and you'll remember that's also what you started off with when you cite the United States Code. You start with the title number. Then you hit the space bar, and now you state the abbreviated title of the code, which is CFR with periods after each letter. Now, if you were citing the United States Code, that is the statutes, it would be USC with periods. But here, since it's a regulation, it's CFR. Then you hit the space bar and you insert the section symbol, which looks like 2 S's superimposed, space bar, and then the section number, 319.76. So here we have the section symbol, space, and then the actual section number. Then you'll want to hit the space bar, and then in parentheses, state the year of the code edition you are citing. And again, you generally will cite the most recent edition, which is clearly not 1999, but this is just an example. And then you put a period after the citation, and that completes your Blue Book citation form for a federal regulation. Now, there may be times when you're citing to a federal administrative rule or regulation that was adopted or amended after the date of the most recent publication of CFR. In other words, it's been adopted, it's officially a rule, but it hasn't yet made it into the CFR. Well, in that situation, you would need to cite to the Federal Register where the final rule appeared instead. Now, how to cite to the Federal Register, little bit beyond the scope of this lecture. So if you want to know how to do that, you'll want to go to the Blue Book, and in the White Pages section, that is the middle section, go to Rule 14.2a, and that rule will prescribe the requirements for how to cite to the Federal Register. Okay, so that's wraps up our survey of federal administrative law, what it is, where to find it, how to cite it. Now I want to look at the same aspects of Texas administrative law. Now, the sources of Texas administrative law pretty much parallel the sources of federal administrative law. For rules that are proposed or newly adopted or newly amended, then you have, instead of the Federal Register in Texas, we call it the Texas Register. And it's not a daily journal as the Federal Register is, but it is a weekly rulemaking journal for the state government of Texas. So it contains proposed, newly adopted, withdrawn, and emergency rule actions, state agency notices, governor's appointments, and Texas Attorney General opinions, and other miscellaneous documents such as requests for rule proposals by an agency. Now, the Texas Register is available for free on the Texas Secretary of State website, and that's www.sos.state.tx.us. So here is the homepage, a screen capture of the Texas Secretary of State. Now, please keep in mind when I have these screen captures throughout this lecture that, of course, they are subject to modification and change. And so the actual version of the website, it may have a different appearance than what you're seeing on the screen right now in the lecture. So just keep that in mind. But here is how you find the Texas Register on the Texas Secretary of State's websites. Across near the top of the screen, you'll see a menu, and you'll want to click on Rules and Open Meetings because we're concerned with rules. So if you hover you should just hover your cursor over that menu, and a drop-down menu will appear. And then in the drop-down menu, you will, of course, want to click on Texas Register. Now, when you do that, this screen appears, or one like it, and let's look at what we have. Toward the bottom, there's a heading Texas Register with some bullet points, and you can click on a link for the current issue of the Texas Register, which, as of the date of this screen capture, was dated November 27th, 2020. And you can access it in HTML or PDF. It's not in digitized format. Now, if you do click on the current issue, this is what you'll see. You'll see basically a table of contents and links to the various types of content. And so if you wanted to see proposed rules from the November 27th issue, you would just click on proposed rules, and then you would see here a PDF of that part of the Texas Register. And it will contain the same types of information about the proposed rules that you saw in the Federal Register. Now, going back to the table of contents for the Texas Register, if you want to see newly adopted rules by Texas agencies, you click on that link, and again, you will have a PDF document pull up that will give you the text of the final newly adopted rules. Okay, so let's now go back to the sort of the home page for the Texas Register. And you can see here that below the link for the current issue, you can also browse previous issues if the rule or proposed rule that you're interested in is not in the current issue. Now below that, you can also word search all issues of the Texas Register from January 28, 2020 to the present. I'm sorry, not 2020, January 28, 2000 to the present. The red comment below the screen capture has the year incorrect. So it's 2020 to present. And if you click on that, you will see the Texas Register viewer. And this gives you lots of different options for search parameters. You can see here that you can search the document text. You type in your keywords or search terms. You can search preamble texts. If you're interested in a rule-related document, you can limit your search to those, or if you want to search other types of material that don't relate to rules, you can click on non-rule and limit your search to those. You can search by agency name. You can search by other, if you know the date of the issue of the Texas Register, you can type in that date and so forth. So here, again, you can see there are lots of different ways you can search depending on the information you have. So that is the free online access to the Texas Register on the Secretary of State's website. Now let's look at how you can access it on Westlaw. Of course, if you have Lexis, you can also access it there. So let's start off at our Westlaw homepage as usual. But instead of going to the Federal Materials tabs, let's go to the State Materials tab. So click on it. And then, of course, click on Texas. Now you are at sort of the home page for Texas resources. Now, to see the Texas Register, you're going to need to scroll down close to the bottom and find Proposed and Adopted Regulations. That heading will be above a link that says Texas Proposed and Adopted Regulations Current. You won't see the words Texas Register. Instead, it will be Texas Proposed and Adopted Regulations. So you would click on that link and it will give you access to the past 2 years of the Texas Register to the present. Now, as we saw with the Federal Register, you will see also here with the Texas Register, the 10 most recent documents in the Texas Register. But again, this works very similarly to the way the Federal Register worked on Westlaw. You can go to the top of the screen right now and search all of the Texas Register issues for proposed and newly adopted rules going back 2 years. And that would be at the top of the page, or you can simply browse the most recent proposed and newly adopted rules, and so and see if they are listed here. Now you do have the option, if you want to look at older issues of the Texas Register, then in the right-hand menu under Tools and Resources, you can click on Texas Administrative Register historical. And that will give you access to proposed and newly adopted rules from the Texas Register from October 3rd, 1989 to December 13th, 2013. Now, let's shift our focus to the source for permanent final Texas regulations. Just as we saw in the federal system that the final federal regulations are ultimately codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, well, in Texas, they are codified in the Texas Administrative Code. And the Green Book abbreviation for Texas Administrative Code is TEX period admin period code. Now, the Texas Administrative Code is divided into 17 titles covering different broad topics, but each Texas agency is assigned to one of these titles. And the print edition of the code, which we'll see in a second, is published annually. So there's a new version of the entire administrative code that comes out every year. So here is the print edition. Now, it's not published by the print edition, it's not published by the Texas government. Instead, it's published by Thomson Reuters West. And so here is a picture of one of the volumes. This is Title 1, which covers the topic administration. And again, you can see it's paperback, and but there are a lot of other volumes. It's not the only one. But you can get the text of the Texas Administrative Code for free on the Secretary of State's website. So let's go, here's the screen capture, back to the home page of the Texas Secretary of State. And again, you'll want to hover your cursor over the Rules and Open Meetings part of the menu, and a drop-down menu will appear. And this time, you'll want to click on Texas Administrative Code. So when you do that, you'll come to the home page for the Texas Administrative Code. So if you want to browse the latest edition of the Texas Administrative Code, then under Quick Links, you'll click on View the Current Texas Administrative Code. If you do that, this screen will appear, and it simply is links to the various titles. And you'll notice that of the 17 titles, they're not all just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are titles that are missing in the number scheme. Now, if you want to search earlier versions of the Texas Administrative Code, that would be in those that were in effect from January 1st, 1999 to current. You can click on this second quick link option and then search those that way. And if you do that, you'll see a similar screen to what we saw when searching the Code of Federal Regulations on the federal government website. And it has some search parameters such as agency name. You can search the text of the rule and so forth to pull up what you're interested in. Now, finally, you can get the Texas Administrative Code, of course, on Westlaw and Lexis. So here's an example for Westlaw. Go back to the Westlaw homepage, click on State Materials, and in the State Materials tab, click on Texas. And then now you'll want to scroll down, but you don't need to scroll down as far as you had to get to the Texas Register. Instead, you'll see pretty quickly the heading Regulations. And under that heading, you'll see the link for Texas Regulations. Now, I'm going to back up one slide to show you that to the right of that is a link to the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 2, for your convenience. So if you want to search Texas regulations or browse them, then you'll want to click on Texas, but you do have the CFR for federal regulations here as an option as well. So let's click on Texas regulations, and we are now at the Texas regulations homepage. Just as we saw on Westlaw for the Code of Federal Regulations, you see a list of the titles below that are expandable if you want to browse them. But you can also go to the top of the screen if you want to do a word search in the entire Texas Administrative Code. You can type it in there. Or if you want to search earlier regulations, that is not the current version, then in the right hand menu under Tools and Resources, you can click on Texas Historical Regulations, and that will take you to a slide where you can choose the year of the edition that you want to search. And then, of course, you can simply browse the titles of the current code. And so let's say you've browsed the titles and you've decided that Title I, Administration, is the title that you're interested in. So just click on that link for Title I Administration or the box to the left of it to open the title. And then you can see that it is composed of multiple parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. So if you want to search Title I and only Title I, then all you have to do is go to the top of the screen and type in your search terms, and Westlaw will search only Title I of the Texas Administrative Code. Or of course, you can browse the text of Title I by looking at the part numbers and seeing which one appears most relevant to your research. So let's say that Part 3, which relates to Office of the Texas Attorney General, appears most relevant. Well, to expand Part 3 to see its contents, click on the plus sign next to the left of it, and you can see that it is divided into multiple numbered chapters. So you can browse those. And let's say that you think Chapter 55, which relates to child support enforcement, is most relevant to your research. And so to see the contents of Chapter 5, then just expand it by clicking on the plus sign. And you can now see that it is further divided into subchapters, A, B, C, D, and F. So choose the one that you think is most relevant. Let's say it's subchapter A, general guidelines about child support enforcement. So to expand subchapter A, just click on the plus sign. And finally, we are now down to the smallest units, that is the section numbers. So you'll just browse the section numbers to see which one appears most relevant. And let's say that section 55.1, agency and agency attorneys in child support cases, is what you want to read. So just click on that link or click in the box to the left of it to read the text of the rule. So you'll see here that the page where the text of the rule appears for section 55.1 very much resembles the text of the CFR section that we looked at earlier. Here's the text of the rule, and then above you have your breadcrumb trail. But now I want to look in more detail at these key cite tabs at the top of the screen. First, you see the History tab. That gives you the direct history of this particular rule. So if you click on that, you'll see these three graphics boxes. Now, notice that the top left graphics box, it doesn't have anything in it, but it could, depending on the section that you've pulled up. It says validity. This box will be very important to check out to see if there is anything negative about that regulation. And so if there are proposed regulations that are currently proposed but haven't been finalized that may negatively impact the regulation, then you will see notations about those proposed regulations in the validity box. That's a very helpful feature if there's a particular regulation that your client is interested in or concerned about. You can keep tabs of it by going in and checking the validity box to see, is there any rules being proposed or in the pipeline that might negatively affect that rule. Also, on the top right box, you have regulatory history, which has former proposed regulations that are relevant to this one. And that, so you can click on that to read the text of former proposed regulations. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to the screen with the text of section 55.1. And now let's look at the key cite tab called citing references. And there are 6 citing references. So if you click on that tab, you will see what other resources have cited or mentioned section 55.1. And so if you click on that tab, here's what you'll see. Now notice in the left-hand column, this is the breakdown of the types of resources that are in this list. And it turns out there's 1 case and 5 administrative decisions that mention this section. And so you can see the list of these resources in the middle column. There's a little summary of what they say underneath each one. If you want to read any of these resources, simply click on the name of it. The date that each resource was issued is in the date column. And then at the far right-hand column, in the type column, it tells you what type of resource. So the first 3 are all administrative decisions. Okay, so finally, let's look at how you cite Texas rules and regulations under the Green Book. Now, as a reminder, the Blue Book is a national book. It's the most widely used citation manual for the law nationwide. But when citing Texas law, especially to courts sitting in Texas, you will want to then supplement the Blue Book with the Green Book, because there are times when the Green Book will modify or add to the citation forms for certain types of resources in the Blue Book. So under Green Book Rule 16.1.1, a citation to the Texas Administrative Code has to include a parenthetical notation that lists first the abbreviated name of the Texas agency that made the rule, followed by the subject heading of the rule. Now, the subject heading of the rule is simply the boldface phrase that is next to the section number before you get to the actual first sentence of the rule. And so Rule 16.1.1 requires in parentheses at the end of the citation that the name of the Texas agency and this subject heading of the rule appear. Now, one thing to note is that whereas the abbreviation under the Blue Book for the Federal Code of Federal Regulations is CFR, under the Green Book, the abbreviation for Texas Administrative Code is not TAC. Rather, it is Tex Admin Code. And also the way to find out how to abbreviate an agency name for the citation is to go back to the Blue Book and look under tables T6 and T10. And those tables combined will show you how to abbreviate the name of any agency in Texas. So here's an example of a citation to a Texas regulation. Let's say you want to cite to Title 4 of the Texas Administrative Code, section 9.12, and that it appears in the 2013 edition. Now, as I mentioned with the Code of Federal Regulations, normally you will cite the most recent edition, but let's say the most recent edition was 2013. And now we also need to know, though, for a Texas regulation citation, that it was the Texas Department of Agriculture that made the rule. And the subject heading for section 9.12 is seed sampling procedures. Okay, so here's how we would construct the citation under the Green Book rule. If we start off with the title number, which is 4, hit the space bar, and then the abbreviated code name, text period, space, admin period, space, code. Hit the space bar, and then insert the section symbol, which looks like 2 superimposed S's, space bar, and then the section number itself, 9.12. Hit the space bar again, and then in parentheses, you will state the year of the publication of the bound volume you're using, which normally, again, should be the most recent, but here it's 2013 purely for illustration. Now, here is where the additional information required by the Green Book comes in. You'll notice that so far the citation looks pretty much like the citation form to the Code of Federal Regulations under the Blue Book. But now we're in Green Book land, so we have to hit the space bar at the end, put in an open parentheses, and then identify the abbreviated name of the Texas agency that made the rule, which was the Texas Department of Agriculture. So by using tables 6 and 10 of the Blue Book to figure out how to abbreviate Texas Department of Agriculture, we come up with TEX space DEP apostrophe T space of space and then AGRIC, AGRIC period, as the abbreviated name of the agency. Okay, and then after you've got your abbreviated name, you want to insert a comma, space, and then the subject heading of the rule, and you don't abbreviate the subject heading rule. So the subject heading of the rule was seed sampling procedures, and then finally you close your parentheses and end it with a period. So little bit longer citation form under the Green Book for Texas regulations because you have to identify the agency and the subject heading for the particular section that you're citing. Now, as with the citing the Code of Federal Regulations, so too with citing the Texas Administrative Code. If you want to cite an administrative rule or regulation in Texas that has been adopted, that is, it's a final rule, but it is so new that it has not yet made it into the latest Texas Administrative Code, then you need to cite instead to the Texas Register. And so, again, citing to the Texas Register is a bit outside the scope of this lecture, but to see how to do it in the proper format, go to Green Book Rule 16.1.2, and you'll see guidance there. So that brings us to the end of our survey of administrative agencies, administrative law, and administrative citation. Thank you for listening.